June Considine, To Dream of White Horses. Some very fine fantasy indeed can be found in young adult fiction these days. Not only overtly wizardly tales of the Harry Potter sort, but contemporary, subtly enchanted stories like the one that follows, in which a young, free-spirited stranger conjures magic with her art. June Considine is an Irish writer who began her career as a journalist and now devotes her time to the writing of novels and short fiction. She has published 12 popular books for children and young adults, including the Lavander's fantasy series, The Glass Triangle, View from a Blind Bridge, nominated for the Bistro Book of the Year Award, and Letters to Nirvana, forthcoming. Her short story, Exposé, published in the Sunday Tribune, was shortlisted for the Hennessy Award, and she has recently published her first novel for adults, When the Bough Breaks. In addition, Considine participates in the Irish radio program Sunday Miscellany and teaches writing workshops. She and her husband live in Malahide, a coastal village near Dublin. To Dream of White Horses is reprinted from Gordon Snell's anthology Thicker Than Water, coming-of-age stories by Irish and Irish-American writers, Delacorte Press. T.W. Last night I watched a nature documentary. I saw a newborn squid rising from the bed of an ocean with nothing to protect them from the lurking dangers floating all around them. No mother, no father. Their parents had paid the ultimate price for their brief encounter by dying as soon as the eggs were laid. They left nothing behind except their genetic imprint and an inherited instinct for survival. The documentary made me think of Zoe, the miracle baby, an orphan before she was born. Her photograph was on the front pages of newspapers. Her birth by cesarean operation was reported on the television evening news. A skid on an icy road, and her parents wiped out before their first child was born. Good media material. She was still kicking when her mother's body was rushed to the maternity hospital. Even then, Zoe was a survivor. We met in February, a cold day, the wind sharp as glass on my face. I huddled into my parka, killing time on a park bench in Stephen's Green. I'd been spending a lot of time in the park, holed up until school was over, and I could safely return to the apartment. Sooner or later, someone always sat down beside me. Old guys with yellow eyes and booze in paper bags. Old women with memories to spend. Mothers watching their children feeding the ducks. But on this particular day, even the ducks were sheltering out of sight on the island in the center of the lake. Zoe was drawing on the pavement, near where I was sitting, a kaleidoscope of colored chalk scattered around her. Her concentration was absolute. I could have been invisible, even when I moved from the bench to see what she was doing. She had drawn a city. High buildings, stick people without features, crazily tilted shops, and office blocks dominated by a hulking mountain in the background. Its height seemed to drain the landscape, dimming the brighter street colors until everything appeared to lie in its dreary, dark shadows. In the corner of the picture I saw a tear, a solitary shining bubble. When I looked closer, I realized there was a tiny figure curled inside it. Zoe sighed impatiently, as if I had disturbed her, and glanced up. Her eyes were a greeny gray, like the sea on those overcast days when clouds are low and the rain is hanging in the air. I know about the sea. I used to watch it from my bedroom window when it roared toward the shore, foaming high and thrashing the rocks. "Shouldn't you be at school, instead of hanging around here, flirting with hypothermia?" she asked. She began the feverish concentration had left her. She stroked the pavement, lightly blurring the shape into the mountain with the flat of her hand. "I should, but I'm not. End of story." "Touchy subject?" "No, just a boring one. It's more educational to watch you work." "Then we'll have to postpone your education for another day." She gathered up the chalk and stood stamping pins and needles from her feet. Her black ankle boots were scratched and covered in chalk dust. As I stood staring at her, not sure what move to make, rain began to fall. We took shelter under a tree as a sudden heavy shower swirled over the pavement, chasing the stick people and splashing off the buildings until only the dark head of the mountain remained. Then it too merged into the running colors and disappeared. "Your drawing is destroyed," I said, wondering how she could be so calm. Hours of detailed work gone in an instant. "So what?" she shrugged. "I can do another one tomorrow." She sounded bored. "Now it's time to eat. I'd like to share some hot chocolate and doughnuts with me." "That's the best offer I've had all day." She allowed me to carry her rucksack to the bench. It looked far too heavy for her slight figure, and like her boots, had seen much wear and tear. We wiped off the rain and sat down. She took out a flask and a bag of doughnuts. 2 ducks waddled from behind the foliage on the island. They nose-dived into the freezing water to prove there was a serious shortage of food, and we rewarded them with sugary crumbs. I had seen homeless people sleeping in shop doorways. They sat on O'Connell Bridge and held cardboard placards in front of them. Their hard, searching eyes carried the secrets of an invisible city. Drugs, alcohol, fights, loneliness, the police moving them on, the long winter nights in the open. It was difficult to connect that world with Zoe. Yet she too sought shelter in abandoned houses or slept in the basements of office blocks. She told me that she was 13 when she went on the road for the first time, escaping from her grandparents, who smothered her with anxiety and rules that had to be instantly obeyed. She was found by the police as she was about to board the ferry at Donlera, but a year later she ran away again. By the time she was 18 and in charge of her own life, she had run away 6 times. Alternative living, she called it. My father would have called it bumming around. Now she was 25. Her grandparents were dead, and the hardness of the city was beginning to touch her mouth. A shadow of things to come, but when she laughed and tossed her hair she was beautiful. Sometimes she was commissioned to paint murals on the walls and hoardings of building sites. Cheerful scenes to hide the destruction going on behind them. Mostly she drew on pavements and hoped that people would throw money at her. She never stayed in the same place for long. When she grew tired of city noises, she headed for the mountains. Every mountain has its ruins, she said, and she would hole up in one of those tumble-down cottages until the streets drew her back again. Her life sounded wild and out of control. I had a sudden urge to walk away from her and half rose from the bench, ready with excuses. She reached out her hand and gripped my wrist. "I need a squat for a few days. Don't suppose you happen to know of an empty house where no one's looking too closely." I didn't want to tell her about Seaview Tower. I didn't want her disturbing the spirits that rested uneasily there. I felt her grip soften as her hand slipped into mine. "A roof. That's all I need, Owen. Even if it's leaking, I can put up the tent inside the house." "I know a place." I pulled her to her feet. "Come on, I'll show you." We took the bus to Corry Pier. White horses were slanting in on the tide, sweeping away the smell of seaweed and the beached dead jellyfish. I carried her rucksack across the road toward the embankment I'd always used as a shortcut to the house. A tall, round tower house guarding the sea. Rosa's house. So flaky and old that only crazy people would want to live in it. My home for 14 years. So close to the shore that sand seeped under the doors, filling corners and crevices, a gritty trail under our feet. In winter the walls wept and sprouted mushrooms. The stained glass panes above the front door cracked at the first sign of frost. Such inconveniences, when she noticed them, never bothered Rosa, my mother. She would proudly point to the carvings on the doors and the oak floorboards in the drawing-room that had once been part of a great ship, insisting I was lucky to live in a house with such character. When my father sold it to a property developer and we drove away, he ordered me not to look back. "The past is a sharp corner," he said. "Once you turn it, there's not a lot of sense in looking behind." "Crazy." Zoe stood back and gazed at the round walls. She took a chisel and mallet from her rucksack. I hammered and levered loose the planks covering the windows and front door, regretting the impulse that had brought me back here. "I don't think this is a good idea," I said. "You'll probably be able to find somewhere much better if you look around." "No, this is it. It's cool." When I forced open the hall door, a newspaper rose from the floor, spreading yellow wings as the wind gusted under it. Zoe kicked aside a beer can, dismissing the litter and the cold and the mouldering smells. She didn't notice the ghosts. "You won't recognize this place when you see it again," she said, and hummed softly as she unpacked her rucksack. In the bus, on the way to the apartment, I imagined her moving through the rooms. She would climb the spiral stairs, the fifth step squeaking in protest when she stepped upon it. Her fingers would touch the gouged wood on the banisters where I had carved my name before leaving with my father. She would stand in my parents' empty bedroom and look down to the wilderness that was once our back garden. Under the weeds and the sucking creepers there were snowdrops, crocuses, and daffodils. As night drew down, she would climb the attic stairs and stand in the gloom of Rosa's studio. The paints were still there, rusting brushes in jars of cloudy water, canvases stacked against the walls. Beyond the window she would watch the lights of Corry Head illuminate the darkness, spilling like a necklace around the lower slopes and climbing upward to the summit, glowing and winking. A golden oasis. Would she feel my mother's presence at her shoulder? Artist to artist, her breath whispering, "See how the night shines, but it's not real, you know. There's a void beyond the glory, and that's what I have to paint." How many times had she breathed those words into my ears? Our eyes fixed on the quivering headland as we tried to imagine the secrets hidden between the folds of light. No, Zoe would not hear my mother's whispering voice. She was a survivor. Seaview Tower would be her shelter until she was ready to move on. Nothing more. In the apartment I saw the bottle of whiskey on the coffee table. A bad sign. My father usually waited until the evening meal was over before pouring his first drink. "You took your time today," he said when I entered the kitchen. He always made the same comment when I was late, but I'd never heard him ask the reason. "Smells good," I sniffed appreciatively when he opened the oven door and carried a casserole dish to the table. "How was school?" "Oh, you know, same as usual." We began to eat. The silence was a sullen space between us. Sometimes I imagined having witty, stimulating conversations with him, but we never managed more than a few sentences before the effort of communicating exhausted us. When he sold Seaview Tower, he gave the furniture away. 2 men from the St. Vincent de Paul Society came and removed everything except my mother's paintings. I believed he was going to bring them to the apartment. "No space," he said when the time came to leave. He allowed me to choose one painting, then firmly closed the door of her studio. The painting hung in my bedroom, a feathery image of green, almost a whisper on canvas, as it drifted above the strong burgeoning roots that thrust downward, forcing their way between rocks and the seething underground world of insect and animal. I was 8 years old when she painted it, and had been repelled by the images. "It's awful, ugly. Trees aren't like that at all. You're always making everything look different." "Ah, but think, Owen." She always smiled when she explained things to me. "Without roots, we have no trees. Can you imagine such a dead world? It's not only what we see and touch and understand that matters. The things we cannot see or touch or understand are just as important." My father used to wink when he heard her talking like that. It beats me what's going on in your mother's crazy, wonderful head." He'd press his lips against her forehead. A time came when he stopped calling her crazy. It became a loaded word. He described her paintings as Rosa's therapy. I can still remember the expression on her face when he said that, as if she had felt the sting of a small stone on her skin. The property developer who bought Seaview Tower planned to build luxury apartments with balconies and glass elevators and a view. The sea shimmering in sunshine. Corry Head shimmering at dusk. "Don't go back there," warned my father. "There'll be heavy machinery. I don't want you getting in the way of the builders." Months later, when I did return, the house was still standing. The panes above the front door were smashed, and graffiti had been sprayed over the outside walls. Cider cans, hamburger cartons, and used condoms littered the hall. Thieves had taken the wrought iron gates. My house had become a sick joke, a hulk. I longed for a crane with a hanging ball to smash it to pieces. But the property developer was having trouble with planning permission. His apartments with a view were still on hold. Soon afterward, he had the doors and windows boarded up. My father bought modern furniture for our new life. Streamlined, minimalist, said the saleswoman. Perfect for an apartment. A fold-up table, spring-back beds, built-in closets, a space for everything. He used one of the rooms as his office. His business card read, "Bill Carter, financial consultant." "Working from home is the way of the future," he said. I figured it was because he couldn't cut the morning traffic with a hangover. Before Rosa left us, he used to travel all the time. New York, Boston, Sydney, Tokyo. He was always landing or taking off on planes. He brought me presents from abroad, denim jackets with American designer labels, the latest computer games, books on astronomy. He bought my mother perfume at airports and was furious when she began to throw the unopened bottles into the garbage. We never had to talk in those days. Rosa was the conduit between us. She told me he was proud and delighted when I earned good grades, made the school athletic squad, joined the debating society. I believed in this dream figure she created, and then discovered she'd left me face to face with a stranger. He switched on the television. We watched the news and a game show. He sipped whiskey and stared into his glass. "It's 2 years today." His voice was flat. "I wondered if you remembered." "Why should I forget?" "Are you all right? Everything okay?" "Sure, it's just 2 years. It seems so long when you say it, but it's not, is it?" "Time passes, Owen." "But it doesn't heal." I wanted to shout at him, but that would be real conversation, so I said the words to myself and switched television channels. He made no effort to make further conversation. That was fine by me. Talking was disastrous when he was drinking. He'd start by reminiscing about his young days and how hard he'd had to work to achieve his success. Young people didn't know the meaning of hard work because everything was laid on for them. We were the wimp generation, hooked on having a good time at any cost. "Spoiled from birth. That's what you are. You haven't a clue. Nancy boys, all of you." He'd thump my arm, laughing. "Big joke. It's a sore spot just above the elbow." His fist was a hard ball digging deep. I'd hit back hard, and he'd hit harder, and then it wasn't a game anymore, but one of those stag things, with the antlers rattling, both of us determined to win. I'd feel sick, unable to stop, yet afraid he'd freak out and let his thoughts spill over. And then what would we say to each other? The dream came again that night. White horses, a herd of them rising from the sea, pounding toward me. Their hooves drummed in my ears. I tried to move out of their way, but my feet sank in sand. Then they were underneath me, and I was rolling over their backs, trying to hold their flailing manes. I went under, sinking deeper and deeper into a void where there was nothing, only the dark silence of drowning. I always woke up on a scream. But there was no scream when I forced my eyes open, just a grinding moan of relief. My file was open on the school principal's desk when I entered her office the following morning. Notes forged with my father's signature was stacked beside it. "I must say, Owen, you look remarkable healthy for someone who's been afflicted by so many ailments." Mrs. Parkinson glanced down at the note on top of the pile. "Your father must be quite worried about you." "The doctor says my immune system is low. I'll be fine when it builds up again." "How long will this build-up process take?" She made no effort to hide her sarcasm. "Soon. I'm on multivitamins and iron tablets." "Spare me the medical report, Owen Carter." She handed me a letter. "Give this to your father. I want to see him in here with you on the Monday following midterm break. Then we'll discuss your immune system, among other things. Is that understood?" Across the bay, Corry Head was beginning to glimmer as evening traffic twisted along the steep, narrow roads. Zoe had lit a fire in the old house, and driftwood blazed up the chimney. Burning candles jutted from wine bottles. In the flickering flames, she seemed to belong to the shadows that had captured the room. She was kneeling on the floor, drawing on the boards, so absorbed I had to call twice before she heard me. "I found photographs of you in that attic room," she said. "You never told me you used to live here." "It's a long time ago." I hunched down to examine her drawing. She had just started to work on it. White lines curling like a question mark into empty space. "Interesting. What's it supposed to mean?" "Whatever you want it to mean." "Who owns the painting upstairs?" "My mother. The attic was her studio." "Cool spot. The light is brilliant, not to mention the view. Does she still paint?" "No." "Where did you find the photographs?" "Stuck in a press with her sketch pads. I'll get them for you." In the grate, the wood burned to fine grey ash. A gas ring fluttered underneath a saucepan, chicken simmering in spices and rice. Familiar smells. I thought about the dinner parties Rosa used to hold, the laughter floating upward into my bedroom. When people stopped coming, there were no more spice smells. Some days she did not get out of bed until I came home from school. Then I made sandwiches and we ate them in the kitchen. She would stare at the wall behind me. When I pushed her hair back from her face, she winced as if the sun hurt her eyes. But I don't remember any sunshine, just clouds moving slow over the sea. "What's depression?" I asked my father. "It's all about the power of the mind," he said. "The only thing that will make it go away is your own determination." He ran his hand over the window ledge and frowned at the smudge on his fingers. When Rosa was happy, our house was filled with music. I could never imagine the silences returning. The light in her studio burned through the night. One summer she painted Corry Head. The gorse blazed like a fireball. Purple heather covered the rocks. She painted it with the mist falling down and hiding all the color. I wondered if that was what her life was like, always trying to escape from behind the mist. I stared at the photographs that charted our 14 years together. In one of them I stood between my parents, toothy grin, my hair neatly parted to one side. "Happy families," Zoe grinned. "That's kind of cute." "Cute?" I placed the album on the mantelpiece, no longer interested. "That's not the word I'd use." My father was right. The past was a sharp corner. No time to dilly-dally on the bend. Every day during midterm break I returned to Seaview Tower, terrified that the builders would have chased her away. The property developer had sorted out his planning problems. Work would begin soon. I imagined throwing myself in front of bulldozers or chaining myself to the front door. Instead, I gathered driftwood, and shopped for food in Corry's town. Zoe picked forsythia and placed it in jars on the window ledges. Her drawing on the floor remained unfinished, but she used my mother's paints to cover the walls with murals. A circus ring, children and clowns turning somersaults. Her rucksack rested near the front door. A house on a frame. So many pockets and loops, each with a purpose, a storage space, a hanging space. Within a few minutes she could pack everything she needed to exist and carry it on her back. We were walking along the Strand one morning when she told me about the accident, the birth of a miracle baby. "My mother wanted to see the mountains in snow," she explained. "There were road warnings being broadcast. Is your journey really necessary, that kind of stuff? Why on earth did he have to listen to her? Why?" I was startled by her anger. It came so fast, as if her breath had suddenly exploded free. Then she tossed her head. "Oh, well, what does it matter now?" A question asked in the same dismissive tone she had used when she watched her chalk city float from the pavement. "Is that why you're always running?" I asked. "I don't know how to explain." She hesitated for an instant. "No one understands." "I want to understand. Tell me." "I'm searching for something I lost before I was born." "Your parents?" "No, I've never had to search for them." She held out her long fingers and examined them. "I have my father's fingers, piano fingers. My mother's eyes. When I smile, I look exactly like her. That's what my grandparents always said. My father's family, too. They never saw me, just the reflections of their lost children." Her voice was low, a talking-to-herself sort of voice. "I've always wanted to take them for granted, but the dead don't allow it. They leave too many questions behind. My parents were just ordinary people, but what happened to them made them extraordinary, and they're here, all the time in my head." I remembered the crush of people in her drawing, the mountains so dark and dominating, the tiny bubble figure. "Aren't you scared being homeless and on your own all the time?" I asked. "Does a home stop you from being scared?" She stopped and turned to face me. "I'm not scared. What makes you think that?" "Do you want to tell me what's wrong?" "There's nothing wrong. Everything's cool." We continued walking by the edge of the shore, adding our footprints to the tiny bird claws and the deep hollows left by the horses from the riding school that had cantered past us. Sand blew in the wind, stinging like needles. We headed toward the beach shelter and sat together on the bench. Zoe used a tissue to remove grit from my eyes. One story borrows another, and so I told her about Rosa. The first time I had mentioned her name since she went away. "Does your father know you come back to the house?" she asked, when I fell silent. "He'd freak if he found out." "Did the two of you ever talk about her?" "Never." "What would happen if you did?" "He'd blame me. I see it in his face all the time." "What if it's his own guilt, you see, his own demons?" "He doesn't have any. He says he did everything for her, and she flung it all back at him." The beach shelter was still the same. Grey pebble dash walls with graffiti. The seeping smell of urine. I wondered if the gang still gathered there at night. Brian O'Neill played guitar with a rock band. Morgan Dunn's father was a doctor with a clinic full of pills. One night, when Rosa was sleeping, I sneaked out and joined them. We played music on ghetto blasters and smoked. We talked about girls and sex and football until Morgan Dunn produced a bottle of vodka. We mixed it with the pills. The sea rolled away from us and the stars streaked across the sky. Blue lights flashed. We were too stupefied to move until the squad car screeched to a halt and the cops came running. They chased us along the hard sand. One of them grabbed me in a rugby tackle. "That's it, you little scumbag," he breathed hard into the back of my neck. "That's the end of your little game." Rosa collected me from the Garda station. She rang my father in San Francisco, and he arrived home 2 days early. "See what you've done to your mother," he shouted, and lifted his fists in the air. I'd never seen him in such a temper. "I hope you're satisfied. You were supposed to look after her when I was away, but all you've done is add to her problems." I was beaten for the first time in my life. "Let that be a lesson to you." His hands shook as he placed them on my shoulders. "I don't ever want to do that to you again, but I will if it's necessary." My dreams changed to drowning of another kind, drowning in Zoe's arms. I wanted to stay there forever, stroking her, kissing her, my tongue moving over her breasts until she moaned and called out my name. Such a wild cry. I woke on the sound, my body releasing its pleasure on the sheets. The spent energy of a fantasy. My skin was on fire. It seemed such an invasion, the things I had done to her without her knowledge. In the bathroom, I lit a match and burned the letter from Mrs. Parkinson. Midterm break was over. I flushed the ash down the toilet bowl. On Monday afternoon, 2 men arrived with tripods and stood at the foot of the embankment. "I'll have to move on soon." Zoe glanced down at them. "It looks like the action is about to begin." "I'm going with you," I said. "I've been thinking of nothing else for days." "That's crazy, Owen. You're just a boy." "I'm 16, and I'm in love with you." "Love?" She dismissed the word. "No one has ever loved me." "Your grandparents did." "It was never love, just duty." "So, what do you call my love? Infatuation? A mother fixation? An escape route?" "Stop it, Owen." She held her palm toward me, warding off my words. "I don't want to hurt you." "Let me go with you, Zoe. I won't make demands or anything. I just want to be with you." She gently pushed me away when I tried to put my arms around her. "There's too many people in my life already, Owen." "Dead people," I said. "You don't need them. You've never needed them. You're the most complete person I've ever known." "I'm always running, but I'm still in the same place. Is that what you want?" She touched my forehead with her lips. No passion, just understanding. So much understanding. Have the courage to set her free. They came the following morning. 2 diggers churned the front garden. The noise from the engines was overwhelming. A crane was already in position in front of the house. Men in yellow jackets and helmets stood beside it. I ran toward them, shouting, "Stop! There's someone living in there." "Stand back, lad. There's no one in there." The foreman held out his hands in front of me. I shoved him aside and ran through the open door. Dead embers, burned-out candles, her rucksack gone. She had finished the drawing on the floor. In the sunshine spilling through the window, the flowing lines were so sharply defined that for an instant they seemed to rise from the floorboards. White horses whirling and circling, onward, outward, an eternal journey of light and shade. Along one wall she had placed my mother's canvases. "Are you happy now?" The foreman stood in front of me. "I told you the place was empty." "You drove her away." My fingers locked so hard together they hurt. "Drove who away? Talk sense, lad. The house was empty when we arrived. Off you go now and let the men get on with their work." I picked up the first canvas. "I'm taking these paintings with me. They're mine." He glanced at his watch and sighed impatiently. "Take whatever you want and be fast about it, or you'll feel the toe of my boot up your arse." In the city I searched for Zoe. No chalk marks on the pavement. The buskers on Grafton Street didn't know anyone answering her description. An old woman with a shopping trolley sat on the park bench and threw bread at the ducks. I asked the same question, and she shook her head. It was late when I returned home. "You took your time today." My father lifted steaks from the grill and laid them on warmed plates. "What kept you?" I stayed back at school to work on a French project. I see. His tone was even as he began to eat. After a few minutes, he laid down his knife and fork and stared at me. His eyes were clear, sparking with anger. I received an interesting phone call today from Mrs. Parkinson. Remember her? She was wondering why neither of us turned up for a certain meeting she arranged yesterday. Apparently you were supposed to give me a letter. I don't remember any letter. He ignored my reply. She also wanted to know why you've been missing so much school lately. But first things first. We'll start with the letter. Show it to me, immediately. I burned it. I didn't want to worry you. That's very kind of you, Owen. At least it would be if I thought you were telling me the truth. The only thing wrong with your immune system is that it's keeping you alive. What have you been doing when you were not at school? Huh? Messing around with drugs? Shoplifting? Joyriding? Tell the truth for a change. It's none of your business what I do. I was on my feet, shouting into his face, not caring any more. They knocked it down today. Every brick. It's all gone. Are you happy now that nothing's left? I told you not to go there. He smashed his fist off the table and rose to face me. But when did you ever do anything you were supposed to do? How would you know? You're never sober long enough to notice. How dare you? How dare you? He hit me, his fist slamming against my chest and shoulders. No games this time. I preferred it this way. I'm sick of it. Do you hear me? I couldn't stop shouting. I'm sick of your drinking and your silence and the way you look at me, as if I'm to blame. I don't want to go on feeling like this, every day feeling I don't deserve to be alive. I want her back again, do you hear me? I want her back. He grabbed me again, holding me hard against his chest until I fell silent. I felt his heart thumping, but then I thought, maybe it's mine, maybe it's both of us. I ran to my room and returned with one of the canvases. He was slumped in a chair, his face in his hands. You want to know what I did today? I asked, my voice quiet now. I placed the canvas in front of him. I took back our past. He touched the canvas, his fingers tensed as if they would burn on contact. I'm so angry, Owen, he whispered. Christ, I am so angry since she went. I left him staring at her painting. Corry Head with the mist falling. My mother was placing daffodils in a glass vase the last time I saw her. The morning news was on the radio. Northern Ireland peace process talks. She switched channels and swayed to the music. Our kitchen was filled with white light. I knew her happiness was as transient as the sunshine. I wanted no part of it. Hurry home from school, Owen, she called after me, and waved in the direction of the headland. I want to paint it again, but different this time. Come with me, won't you? I nodded and slung my school backpack over my shoulder. I can't remember if I kissed her. I think not, but I hope I did. After school, I went into Dublin City with Morgan Dunn. We played computer games and went to the cinema. It was dark when we reached the beach shelter. Morgan had white pills. We mixed them with cider. I lost time that night. I saw shapes on the sea. A ship with lights sailing over the sand. A circling moon. As soon as I entered the house, I knew it was empty. Yet I searched every room, calling her name over and over again. Then I ran down the embankment and onto the strand. A man walking his dog had seen a woman on the rocks below Corry Head. He worried because the waves were high. A spring tide, treacherous. I rang the police and then my father in New York. I have no memory of how we passed the time while we waited for news of her return. People called and spoke in quiet voices. Their fixed, reassuring smiles terrified me. The search lasted for 3 days, until her body was swept ashore on an incoming tide. The call of cormorants rose from the rocks, a shrill warning as I climbed through the barrier at the end of Corry Pier. I stood on the narrow ledge, staring down into the water. Zoe had shaped my nightmare on the floorboards, white horses riding the night. Beneath the turmoil, I sensed the stillness, the invisible depths of silence. I imagined my body falling like a stone, drawn down under the waves until it was floating in the timeless rhythm of tides. My heart began to beat faster. A step closer, and it would be over. I swayed forward. How could she leave me with nothing but guilt to mark our years together? Spray stung my eyes. I couldn't remember the last time I cried. My anger flowed into the sea. White horses lifted it, tossed it high, and gave it back to me, a spent force. For a dizzy instant, my mother and Zoe merged and became one, moving away from me as the tide raged upward against the pier. Pictures I could not see or touch or understand flowed around me. They formed a space that I must not be afraid to enter. A space where pain had to be endured so that it could pass away, where the waves wasted upon the sands before turning to gather strength for a new day. The moon came out, a pale lantern shining, a room blazing with the light of many candles. I imagined Zoe trudging over mountains, alone in an empty landscape, thinking thoughts of what might have been. My mother came slowly from the mist where I had walked since she died. "Rosa, Rosa," I whispered her name. "What happened to you? That's the most awful part, not knowing." No one answered. No one ever would. Some questions have no answers. White horses reared toward us, ready to carry her safely home. Headlights swept the sea. A car braked sharply. A door slammed. "Owen!" My father's voice carried above the waves. It could have been a question, or maybe it was a cry. I heard his footsteps on the pier. I turned and hurried toward the sound.